Nailed. 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All by David Fitzgerald. On the back cover, we read, "Why would anyone think Jesus never existed? Isn't it perfectly reasonable to accept he was a real first-century figure?" As it turns out, no. Nailed sheds light on 10 beloved Christian myths, and, with evidence from historians across the spectrum, show how they point to a Jesus created by an allegorical alchemy of hope and imagination, a Messiah transformed from a literary, theological construct into the familiar figure of Jesus. In short, a purely mythic Christ. Nailed was published in 2010 at a time when the vast majority of people familiar with the origins of Christianity considered Jesus to be a historical figure. And while that is still the case, the past decade has definitely seen a change in the numbers. More and more people, from casual readers to critical scholars, have come to believe that there might not have been a man named Jesus whose teachings inspired the earliest Christians. And that shift in belief is a direct result in the strong case which has been presented by critical mythicists. And many who have reached that conclusion began to learn about the topic from this very book. So what is Nailed? David Fitzgerald introduces us to the concept of Jesus mythicism by shedding light on 10 common arguments that demonstrate Jesus was actually a real-life person who once existed. And by shining that light on those arguments, he demonstrates how poor the evidence for the historical Jesus actually is. So, what are these 10 myths? He conveniently uses these 10 myths as the chapter titles. 1. The idea that Jesus was a myth is ridiculous. 2. Jesus was wildly famous, but... 3. Ancient historian Josephus wrote about Jesus. 4. Eyewitnesses wrote the Gospels. 5. The Gospels give a consistent picture of Jesus. 6. History confirms the Gospels. 7. Archaeology confirms the Gospels. 8. Paul and the epistles corroborate the Gospels. 9. Christianity began with Jesus and his apostles. And 10. Christianity was totally new and different. He wraps up the book with an 11th chapter entitled, Conclusion, Can Jesus Be Saved? In this final chapter, he outlines what we would need to rescue the hypothesis of historicity. The outline of each chapter is simple. Present the claim, such as Josephus wrote about Jesus. Then examine the evidence for this claim, the state of that evidence, the scholarly debates concerning that evidence, and what conclusions we might draw from said evidence. Then he meanders off down a multitude of rabbit holes, investigating parallel lines of inquiry that might be used to bolster the original claim. Were there other historians in the 1st or 2nd century AD who mentioned Jesus? What did they say? Where did this information come from? Are their sources reliable? And has any of this evidence been tampered with by later Christians? While it's difficult to say that he leaves no stone unturned, this is meant to be an introduction to the topic and a refutation of the 10 most common arguments. And he certainly answers all the questions and objections you might have, and raises a great many more that you likely never even considered. For a book this size, it's incredibly thorough, and despite the numerous advancements in the topic which have occurred in the decades since its publication, this book doesn't feel dated at all. This is likely because he incorporated the work of cutting-edge scholars in the fields of biblical criticism, history, and early Christianity. Notable names such as Bart Ehrman, Richard Carrier, Dennis MacDonald, and Robert L. Price, just to name a few. Now, some of the topics on the periphery that the book explores includes the many maritime adventures of Jesus, which seems strangely out of place in a landlocked region, and why those adventures are important, as well as where those stories originated. He also brings up the numerous irregularities in Jesus' trial and what a trial of that sort would actually look like. objections and concerns that were raised by early Christians who noticed serious problems with the gospel claims, and even Christian historians who were open and proud forgers who then defend their shady practices from criticism during their own lifetime. Why would a crowd choose to release Barabbas instead of Jesus? Did this practice of releasing a convicted criminal on Passover actually exist? Why would Pilate capitulate to an angry Jewish mob? While these details and others like them make no sense from a historical standpoint, they all serve a theological purpose. And once Fitzgerald points out those details and the purpose they serve, they make perfect sense as literary devices. New towns and customs were invented. An entire inland sea was created entirely out of thin air in order to serve as a setting for dangerous sea voyages, because the source material used by the gospel authors included scenes that they wished to replicate. But beyond all of that, he points out that early Christians, those who wrote decades before the Gospels were written, weren't silent on the life of Jesus at all. They had a lot to say. It just doesn't match up with what we would expect if Jesus had lived on earth. Nailed is the product of a 15-year analysis of the topic by researcher David Fitzgerald, and for anyone interested in the topic of Jesus mythicism, it's the best place to start. If you've always assumed that there had to be a man at the beginning of the religion, then I strongly recommend that you pick up a copy of this book. Regardless of how you feel at the end, you'll be amazed at how many facts about Jesus and early Christianity were actually mere supposition and assumption with, at best, little to no supporting evidence, or at worst, it completely contradicts the available evidence. Despite its density, Nailed is an easy read for the layperson. David Fitzgerald plucked the reliable information from the top shelves of the stuffy ivory tower of scholarship, and he placed it on the coffee table for easy consumption. This book, however, doesn't have everything. It's meant to debunk 10 common arguments for the historical Jesus. There are countless other objections to the mythicist hypothesis that skeptics have raised since this book's release. Fortunately, Fitzgerald has answered those critics with a follow-up, Jesus Mything in Action. I hope this review helps you, and if you found it useful, please subscribe to my YouTube channel so you don't miss the next book recommendation.